Greetings, viewers! This is the third and final video in a short series examining the issue of trans women athletes. Links to parts 1 and 2 are in the info bar. In this part, I'll be examining 5 or 6 common policy options that are used by various organizations with regards to trans athletes. Many of the policies I discuss in this video are listed either in this research paper, which I talked about in my last video, or transathlete.com, both of which I highly recommend as a source of information. Alright, enough setup, let's jump right in. We should start this discussion by noting that, especially in high school sports, many of these policies are not decided on a wide level, but are left to case-by-case participation rules. This is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, especially in the ever-changing world of high school, the decision of whether a particular player has too much of an advantage over their competitors might be best made by the student and faculty involved. They would know whether the student had started hormone therapy, whether they dramatically upset the level of competition, what options the school can offer, etc. For many trans students, letting schools decide their participation on a case-by-case basis might let them participate in an area where they might otherwise be banned. But the reverse is also true. Without district-wide standards to protect trans students, leaving their fate in the hands of local faculty may leave them unfairly banned or restricted. In the end, high school sports are mainly present to give students the opportunity to train, exercise, and experience team play. A school that discourages a trans athlete from playing on the team of the gender they identify with might be failing to meet these goals. Joanna Harper, the researcher whose paper I cited in the previous video, suggests a standard where high school trans female athletes who have not started hormone replacement therapy could participate but not win titles. This would allow for full participation without letting clear bodily advantage be responsible for awards.
I would draw a line at winning state titles, getting medals at state titles. So had I been making the rules, I would have allowed these two girls to participate in the state final, but not win medals there.
She clarifies that the situation is not the same for those trans students who have undergone HRT. One policy option is simply to restrict all players of a sport to playing on teams that match their sex as assigned at birth. The attraction of this policy option is its apparent simplicity, but it's a measure that is unlikely to leave anybody happy. Trans men who are taking testosterone would have a clear advantage over their cis female teammates, as in the case of Mac Beggs. Mac himself wanted to play on the boys' team, but was prevented by by the strict assigned at birth policy of the state of Texas. This assigned at birth approach might satisfy people who value simplicity or feel that the sexes should be segregated for reasons other than fairness, but it comes at the harsh cost not only of giving up an even playing field, but also making transgender students play on the team of the gender they don't identify with. Occasionally, you'll hear a commentator take this to the extreme and suggest that to handle the issue of trans men having an advantage over their cis women competitors, these players should be treated like dopers and banned from the sport entirely.
Saying, all right, you actually feel like a female or you feel like a boy trapped in a female body, sorry, you don't get to compete in any sports now.
Unfortunately,
who's that fair to?
It comes with the territory, I would suggest. I would suggest that if you're going to make this choice, it's going to come with a lot of baggage. We know that.
Thankfully, this approach is generally not taken seriously by sporting organizations. Completely ostracizing trans men who are on testosterone would be an undeserved severe punishment that only serves ideas of gender segregation rather than the creation of a fair playing field. In this same category of unrealistic suggestions is the idea that there should be a special league specifically for trans female athletes. Nobody who is aware of the numbers involved can seriously recommend this as a viable requirement. Although there are special LGBT sports leagues, none of them were created with the idea that LGBT players would be limited only to such leagues. There are not nearly enough trans athletes to form a separate league in most sports, certainly not in an individual high school or even the largest universities. Requiring trans athletes to compete in their own league is effectively the same as banning them altogether. There are still a few organizations that require trans women to complete gender-confirming surgery before competing, but this approach is quickly falling out of favor. The International Olympic Committee, for example, recently dropped this requirement from their own rule set, but many groups continued to use either the 2004 IOC standards or their own standards requiring evidence of surgery.
I knew I would not be eligible to compete in the World Championship race the following year because of the International Olympic Committee policy and guidelines on transgender athletes, which at that time stated that all transgender athletes needed to have a full lower surgery, including internal and external modifications. And so I knew if I made Team USA, it would be a year of talking about what's in my pants.
Advocates may see genital surgery as a form of gatekeeping, guaranteeing that trans competitors are serious about transitioning, but only a portion of trans people seek out reconstructive surgery, and even for those who do, surgery can be prohibitively expensive or otherwise unavailable. Sports programs don't need to be trans gatekeepers, and there's no nascent swarm of cis men waiting to sneak into women's sports, only deterred by the requirement to undergo surgery. Finally, from the perspective of physical fairness, requiring surgery doesn't make much sense. It's much more direct to simply measure hormone levels. Another policy option is to allow transgender women to compete if their testosterone falls within an acceptable range. The strength of this test is that it is relatively easy to measure, and it allows trans athletes flexibility with respect to surgery. The new IOC standards require testosterone levels to be held under 10 nanomoles per liter for 1 year, and a 1-year minimum for hormone replacement therapy is seen in organizations like Ladies Professional Golf Association and the NCAA. The 10 nanomoles per liter standard set by the IOC is very possibly a compromise number. That number is far above the typical range of both cis women and trans women, but may be necessary to include natural outliers. There are downsides to requiring these testosterone levels. For one, as mentioned in the previous video in this series, testosterone alone is not as clear an indicator of athletic performance as we might like to think. Trans women who have undergone male puberty may still have an athletic advantage after only 1 year of HRT. Testosterone tests are also a bit of a burden on trans athletes, who need to deal with the extra costs and planning that their cis counterparts don't need to worry about. All that said, this approach might be seen as the best compromise, mixing both practicality and fairness. Some organizations include some level of official gender declaration as a requirement for trans women to compete in the female categories. The current IOC standard requires trans women to have, quote, declared their gender as female for at least 4 years, and the 2004 version of the policy, still in use by many organizations, requires legal recognition of gender. These kinds of identity-focused standards seem to once again be a form of trans gatekeeping, protection against protesters or the bogeyman stealth cis male. As mentioned in the first video in this series, the threat of insincere trans people is vastly overstated, but there are cases where viewers may consider these standards justified. For example, the UK Roller Derby Association specifies that trans women, quote, must be living full-time as their chosen gender, close quote. But they otherwise require no evidence either of hormone levels or of gender identity. Their standard might be seen as a base protection against trolls or protesters in response to their otherwise very lax restrictions. It's worth pointing out in this discussion that there are some organizations with essentially no restrictions on participation for trans female athletes. Roller derby organizations already tend to be very liberal in their rules, as mentioned, but according to the Jones study, there are at least 2 other organizations with essentially no restrictions: USA Swimming and, the International Quidditch Association. Outliers, certainly, but it is worth considering why these organizations can't afford to have such loose restrictions. Maybe it's because Quidditch and roller derby are somewhat niche team sports where ensuring a welcoming atmosphere is more important than maintaining some kind of strict measure of fairness? But this doesn't explain USA Swimming. Examples like USA Swimming could show that lenient restrictions simply aren't likely to result in a sport being dominated either by cis men in disguise or by trans athletes deliberately maintaining high testosterone levels. There simply aren't enough trans women athletes to seriously disrupt these sports with their current policies. So there you have it. These are the most common policy options discussed or in use today. Which policy option you should support depends greatly on what you feel the purpose of a sport should be. Is your goal to encourage participation and exercise? Or to provide an exciting show that will draw an audience? Or to act as an international celebration? In all of these cases, banning anybody from the sport will come with a big price to pay, and should be carefully backed up with adequate justification. Sports are, and likely will always be, an expression of humanity, encouraging self-improvement, praising our best achievements, and joining together in ways that cross borders and cultures. That alone deserves our consideration, and perhaps a cheer. Thank you so much for joining me in this short series examining this very important topic. I hope you'll take the time to share your thoughts in the comments, and more importantly, I hope that this information brought you some insight on what policy options you can support and why. Thank you for your time.